For generations of mankind, there's often been a fond belief that once a man marries a woman, that woman becomes his sole property. But in 1891, this archaic law would be tested. And this, my friends, is the true story of Emily Emma Maud Jackson. Emily Emma Maud Hall. She was born on the 10th of February 1846 and she was the youngest of 3 sisters, and she lived at Shawbridge over in Clitheroe. But our story truly begins on Saturday, November the 5th, 1887, when Emily married Edmund Horton Jackson in a secret ceremony over at St Paul's Church in Blackburn. In 1885, Emily and Edmund had become good friends, close friends, but they weren't a courting couple. There was no romance involved at all. But they would often be seen, quite regular, walking together in and around Blackburn as well as Clitheroe. Now Edmund, he would though propose to Emily on numerous occasions, but Emily just was not interested in being married. 2 years later, in 1887, and it was whilst on a trip to see some friends in Chatburn in the Ribble Valley, Edmund would again propose to Emily, and after some considerable persuasion, Emily this time accepted that proposal. The reason being, Edmund himself had made plans to leave England and to go to Australia and New Zealand to set up some kind of business, and I think it was in the farming industry. And Emily, who was a bit scared of losing Edmund, and I know they were only friends, but obviously he kept proposing, she decided to say yes to his proposal. Now this was on November the 2nd, 1887. Now after accepting his proposal, Emily agreed to meet with Edmund at his sister's house, Isabella, at number 2 Rover Street over in Blackburn. And here they would make this plan, this arrangement to be wed. And this is how quick things escalated, because it was the following Saturday when they would meet up at St Paul's Church over in Blackburn. So we're talking November the 5th. They would be married in secret. Even Emily's family would not get wind of what they were doing. Now, this is the former site of St Paul's Church here in the heart of Blackburn. And as you can see, the church is no longer here. It was demolished, well, quite a few years ago. But there are signs, such as some graves just along this stretch here. But it is here where that marriage between Emily and Edmund took place back on the 5th of November, 1887, and it was somewhere just around here. And we'll put pictures over of what the church once looked like. Now, one thing I did forget to mention was that Emily did indeed accept at least one proposal from Edmund leading up to the marriage itself. But she pulled out of that engagement because she found out quite soon, quite rapidly, that Edmund was about to leave the United Kingdom. Now, obviously, what was the point in being married to somebody who wasn't going to be in the country? So she kind of walked away from the engagement itself, but Edmund would soon talk around, and that would happen over, as we said, in Chatburn. Now, as for Emily herself, she was quite a wealthy woman. She was valued at around £27,000 back in the 1800s, so 1887. We've done the math, and it equates to roughly 4.3 million in today's value. So one wealthy lady. Now, as for Edmund, he came from a working class background, a middle class working background, I should say. So he wasn't broke, he wasn't poor, but he didn't have enough money to look after himself as well as a wife. And he admitted this to Emily. Now, people are going to ask, well, why would Emily, who's obviously wealthy, who wasn't romantically interested or invested in Edmund for 2 years before accepting his proposal, why would she accept it on this one occasion? And from all accounts and from what we've read in the newspapers, she would later do an interview with a journalist and explain this, and she was a little bit worried about losing Edmund to the overseas, to going over to New Zealand, because she appreciated the close friendship they did have, albeit not romantically. So I think, in her words, what she was saying is she would rather be wed to Edmund and hope that he would change his mind and stay in the UK. When she put this to Edmund, Edmund said he couldn't stay because he invested quite a lot of money that he did have into this business venture. He'd paid for tickets, he'd paid for all these packages, as he says in the papers, to be deported to Australia. So he'd invested quite a lot of the money that he did have into this business venture. Now, Edmund left the UK the following day after the wedding. So they were married on November the 5th, which was a Saturday, and by Sunday, November the 6th, Edmund had left Clitheroe and made his way down to London, where he would then leave the UK to make his way over to Australia and into New Zealand. It wouldn't take long before Edmund and Emily were sending communications by letter to each other. But with Edmund, it was always asking about money. He was demanding more money to be sent over to him. Now, even Isabella, Edmund's sister, would get in the odd remark with Emily, which would then raise Emily's suspicions as to why he wanted more and more money. Now, obviously, Emily began to sense something, maybe his true intentions, and she would refuse to send further finance over to Australia and to Edmund. Many letters between the couple would continue until Edmund returned back to England in 1889. Now, upon Edmund's return back to England at the start of that year, Emily ceased all direct communications with him. No letters, she wouldn't speak to him, she would not see him. But Edmund had other ideas. And in 20th of February 1889, he would apply to the courts for a decree of the restitution of conjugal rights. Now, simply put, he was trying to force Emily back to him. And if she refused to go back to him, he was hoping that she would be sentenced to prison time. Emily, now she scoffed at this whole situation, and she would not take Edmund on with it. After all, this decree and this archaic law was kind of closed, the loophole was closed with, I think it was pronounced the Matrimonial Act of 1884. And this basically prevented anybody, man or woman, from being sentenced to prison until they agreed to return to their partner. Now, there is a case from 1840 which highlights this horrific punishment, and it involved a lady called Mrs. Cochran, and she refused to go back to her husband. So this decree of the restitution of conjugal rights was placed upon her. Now, she would actually die in prison because she would spend decades refusing to go back to her husband. Now, we do have a quote from one of the newspapers back from the 1800s, and I'm going to read it to you now to show you just how archaic these laws were. And it goes like this: "The husband hath by law power and dominion over his wife, and may keep her by force within the bounds of duty, and may beat her, but not in a violent or cruel manner." Now, that is so bizarre and wrong. I mean, where do you draw the lines when it comes to beating your partner, your wife? What force is deemed okay to use? I also read another article about a man can beat his wife with a stick as long as it's no longer than the forearm, and it cannot be more than 1 centimetre in diameter, the thickness. But what is reasonable force? And should there be any force? Now obviously we know there should never be any force, there should be no beatings on a man or a woman in a marriage. But these laws existed back in the 1800s. And like I keep using the word archaic, they are archaic laws. Thankfully, these laws have long since been banished. Emily, scoffing at this decree and disobeying it completely, she tried to move on with her life. And for the next 2 to 3 years, Edmund would stew. He would be absolutely fuming from all accounts that his wife basically disobeyed not just his orders, but what he thought was the law. Now, obviously, the embarrassment, the humiliation that he was also probably facing from people who he knew, that would push Edmund into doing drastic things. And on the 8th of March 1891, things would escalate outside a church over in Clitheroe. Emily, she used to visit St Mary Magdalene C of E Church over in Clitheroe on many occasions. But unbeknownst to her, she was also being watched by, well, you could use the word spies, that Edmund had paid to go and keep a lookout for Emily. Now, on 3 occasions, Emily, she didn't go to the church on 3 Sundays. So Edmund had to bide his time a little bit more. Now, on one Sunday in particular, on the 8th of March 1891, word had got back to Edmund that Emily had attended the church. And he quickly made his way over to the churchyard, which is on Church Street in Clitheroe. And he would wait patiently inside the horse-drawn carriage. Now, from all accounts, it was a bit of a wet, miserable, cold day. But this still wouldn't stop all the parishioners making their way to church. Now, after the service had ended, and Emily, along with her sister Betsy, once they had left the church and they were making their way towards the Lich Gate, a little tap on the carriage alerted Edmund. He jumped from the carriage and he grabbed Emily by one of her arms. He then began to drag her towards the carriage, where he would shout for 2 of his accomplices to give him a hand. Now, one of those accomplices was Mr. Dixon Robinson, and the other accomplice was that of his brother, Dr. William Robinson. Now, between them, all 3 men would drag Emily into the waiting carriage. And from Emily's own words, she would describe how that event unfolded. I was dragged roughly backwards into the bottom of the carriage, my legs hanging out. Whilst in this position, my sister's clasp from my waist was torn away with such force that the fingers of one hand were more seriously injured. One of them threatened to be permanently disabled. And when this had been done, she was violently thrown backwards, and afterwards she had to be carried home by several people. When I was on the floor of the carriage, I heard Mr. Jackson cry out, "For God's sake, help me, Dick." And it was at that moment that my sister and I were pulled apart. Now, with all this commotion going on with Betsy and Emily, there was a lot of people outside. All the parishioners outside were watching all this unfold, and not a single person stepped in to help. In fact, one of the Robinson brothers, Dr. William Robinson, held his hand up and shouted, "It's no use, it's no use." He was basically telling everybody to back off and let the men do what they were doing. Now, the carriage door was slammed shut, and poor Emily, she was confined in this small little segment, this little area. The carriage then sped off, to make its way to number 2 Rover Street over in Blackburn. Now, number 2 Rover Street was the former home of Edmund's sister, Isabella. And Isabella was waiting for the couple to arrive that morning. Now, as Emily entered the house, Isabella approached her as if she was going to kiss her on the cheek in a welcoming way. But Emily drew back and said, "Yes, and you know how I've come here and why I'm here." Isabella's tone changed at this point, and she came out with some kind of outburst, basically insinuating that Emily herself was an embarrassment to society. She was an outcast, a social outcast, as she said to one reporter, and that she brought shame and disgrace not only to herself, but to that of her own family, and especially to her brother Edmund. Whilst in the house, and as soon as they arrived, as soon as Isabella had kind of finished her rant and her expletives, because she swore quite strongly towards Emily, Edmund came into one of the rooms where this was all kicking off. And Edmund demanded that Emily take her bonnet off. Now, obviously, Emily, she was still in shock at this point. I mean, one quite rightly would be. So he tore at the bonnet, ripping it from her hair, from her head. Now, Emily, again, she would later tell a journalist in a report that she would do several months after the events of what happened on this day. And she would tell this reporter that she had 2 hairpins that's 6 inches long that were fixed to the hair itself. She had a tight strand around her chin, obviously to keep the bonnet on, but as Edmund pulled it, it nearly choked her. It left a mark around her chin and her neck. Segments or pieces of her hair were also pulled out due to the force. There were also 2 4-inch pins fastened tightly to a veil that was covering the face. Again, all this was rough, shoddy treatment from Edmund onto his wife, Emily. It didn't take long before Betsy and her husband Hartley made their way to Rover Street over in Blackburn. They wanted to find out what was going on and why had Edmund acted in such an irrational way. When they got there, they could not get entrance into the house. Every door, every window was barricaded. The doors were bolted shut. Emily was seen from an upper floor window. She was in hysterics. She was crying at this point, and she was asking her sister Betsy and her brother-in-law Hartley to try to get her out. They couldn't do so. So they called for the Chief Superintendent of Blackburn to come along. Now, he came along and he said there's nothing he could do. I can't do anything. After all, back in those days, an Englishman's house was his castle. Now, on the following morning of the abduction, newspapers, milk and other necessities were brought to the house. Now, the chief constable himself thought that this would be the perfect opportunity to get inside and to hopefully help poor Emily. But he hadn't anticipated on the technology that Edmund and Isabella had in the house, that being of a telephone. Obviously, they'd made arrangements, they'd made plans, and when these articles arrived, the newspaper, the milk and other bits and bobs, a window was opened again from one of the upper floors. A rope was sent out which held a basket, and all these items were placed in the basket and winched up and into the house. So the chief constable's plan of waiting it out kind of failed, and Edmund had the upper hand still at this point. On the 11th of March, to try to speed things up and to hopefully free Emily from her ordeal, Betsy, along with her husband Hartley, would bring legal proceedings against Edmund as well as his 2 accomplices for the assault that took place not only on Emily, but also on that of Betsy herself. You see, Betsy, she suffered from severe bruising because of all the pushing and shoving and grabbing that took place on the Sunday morning. She would also faint from her ordeal, and she had to be carried to her house at Prospect House, just directly opposite the church itself. Now, with these charges against Edmund and his accomplices, he had no option but to leave the house. He had to go and answer to these charges. And he kind of, I don't know how he managed it, but he had people who could help him. And as soon as he left the house, 6 men entered it. And they were there to prevent other people from getting in, as well, like I said, people leaving. So no matter what was thrown against Edmund, these charges of assault, people still could not get access to poor Emily. Now, nothing came of these charges that Betsy herself and Hartley had filed against Edmund, the assault charges. Nothing came of it. For 10 days, more dramatic details of the case filled pages of all the newspapers, not just locally, but nationwide. This case was becoming huge. Crowds thronged the streets in spite of the snow and bitter wind, but the police themselves, they were always on hand to try to sort of keep and maintain the peace. Now, all the time, Emma herself would be seen from one of the upper ground windows in distress, and she'd be weeping and begging to be taken away from her ordeal. Now, undeterred, Betsy, as well as Hartley, they would find a way to finally free Emily from her ordeal, and that was to apply for a writ of habeas corpus, which simply meant Edmund, by law, had to produce Emily in court. He had to take her to court to explain why he'd done these horrible things to poor Emily. Now, it was on March the 16th, 1891, when Emily and Edmund would appear in court. And the Queen's Bench would originally side with Edmund, saying he had done nothing wrong in the eyes of the law. He had acted upon what a married man could act upon, and that was taking by force his wife and keeping her, best foot want a word, kidnapped. However, like I said, this law was archaic, and a new law had come in 1884. So why the Queen's Bench kind of sided with Edmund, we just don't know. We can't understand it. But an appeal was made the following day, and this time Emily would be freed. Now, with the Court of Appeal favouring with Emily and she was finally set free, word got back to Clitheroe and an angry mob would soon transcend not only where she lived at 15 Shawbridge, but also the house of where Betsy and her husband Hartley lived. And that was Prospect House, which was directly opposite or at the side of the church itself. This angry mob would whistle and jeer when Betsy arrived and when Emily arrived. They would throw stones at the windows, smashing several of them. They would also be cheering and singing songs such as "He's a Jolly Good Fellow" to try to defend and respect Edmund's own virtues. There was also an effigy planned to be burned of Emily in Market Street in Clitheroe. Now, thankfully, this never occurred. The angry mob, like I said, they were just fuming over this decision, and they went instead to the two houses which Emily had once shared with her sister Esther, and obviously Prospect House where her other sister lived with Hartley. With Emily obviously probably fearing for her life at this point, over the coming days, little old Edmund, on the other hand, he was being patted on the back, he was being praised, he was receiving sympathetic letters, sympathetic cards. He was also having funds set up on his behalf to take this to the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords and any future appeals never quite took off. And in one interview later on in the next few months, one interview with Edmund Jackson, he would tell the reporter that he actually wanted a divorce from Emily at this point, but the law would not allow it. Now, I don't know anything about marriage laws, matrimonial laws. I don't know when divorces and that side of it were permitted in the United Kingdom. But certainly, Edmund did tell this one reporter that he was looking for a divorce, but the law would prohibit that. Now, this fight between Edmund and Emily wasn't just a fight for them. It was a fight for women's rights in general. And this one ruling, this one decision by the House of Lords, it would have ramifications long term, and it would change the law when it comes to the dissolution of a marriage and the ownership of a man over his wife. The days, the weeks, the months, even the years after this event that took place in Clitheroe, Emily moved in with her sister Betsy as well as her brother-in-law Hartley at Prospect House. And on the 21st of March 1898 she would sadly pass away. She would die from heart failure from septicemia. She had blood poisoning. And this occurred because she was cutting away at a corn that was on one of her feet. And the dye in the stockings that she was wearing would lead to this blood poisoning. And it is here, just at the side of me, where Emily lays to this day. Now it is here where Emily, as you can see from the inscription on this vault, clearly shows. And it says simply, Emily Emma Maud, wife of Edmund Horton Jackson and youngest daughter of Henry Hall, who died March the 21st, 1898, aged 54 years. And just at the side, just here, it also says Betsy, widow of James Mottershead, who died June 30th, 1850, aged 59 years. And then when we go to this side, you've got Esther Ann Maud, second daughter of Henry Hall, who died March the 26th, 1908, aged 65 years. And as we know, Esther is the sister who she stayed with soon after their mother's passing at 15 Shawbridge. Now on this side we have the mother and father. Mary Ann, widow of Henry Hall, born March the 21st, 1814, died May 24th, 1878. And then to her side we've got Henry Hall, born June 7th, 1807, died November 30th, 1875. Now let's have a look at the final side. Yeah, and there's nothing on this one. So you've got mother, father, you've also got two sisters, but I'm not entirely sure who this Betsy is. Betsy, widow of James Mottershead. Not entirely sure who this lady is. Obviously related. But this is certainly the final resting place of poor Emily Emma Maud, wife of Edmund Horton Jackson, and a true pioneer when it comes to changing matrimonial laws throughout the United Kingdom. So that is all from here at All Hallows Church here in Mitton. We do hope you've enjoyed this story. It isn't one of the most gory, well, it isn't gory, and it isn't one of the most morbid, but it is still a fascinating, true story nevertheless, and it is history changing. Throughout this story, it's always been about the man possessing ownership of a woman, but Emily would change that. She would fight for her rights. Her family would fight for her rights, more importantly, Betsy and Hartley. But if it wasn't for those people in time, back in 1891, who knows what today's society would be like in terms of marriage? It is hard to fathom, it's hard to understand, but how a man could have so much hold over a woman all those years ago and be allowed to do pretty much what he wanted. Comment down below your thoughts. Have you heard the story of Emily Hall, or Emily Jackson as she would later be known as when she married Edmund? Comment down below, tell us your thoughts. But in the meantime guys, we're going to shoot off, so we want you to take care, look after yourselves, and we will be back soon with more tales from a dark but at times glorious past. So take care everybody.